If you've been fascinated by the Scandi interior design style, but had no idea which paint colors to go with, this is the video for you because I have 8 Scandinavian inspired paint colors by Sherwin-Williams that I'm delighted to share with you today. This video was made possible by our friends at Mighty Boards, which create some of the best testing boards that we've ever tried out on the Paint People. Sometimes the simplest solution is the best one, and Mighty Boards have really nailed it. What makes them so great is they are large paintable surfaces that give you much more room to interpret any paint color you want, but also the material that they're made of is resistant to warping and bending, which means they're not going to alter the color's appearance with pesky shadows. I'm sure a lot of you have used those tester boards that do bend and show those unsightly shadows, which is not going to help you whatsoever in the testing process. You want your testing surface to sit nice and flat, and that's exactly what Mighty Boards do. So before you go and test out these Scandi paint colors, click the link down below in our description and pick up some Mighty Boards for yourself so you can save your time and your money. When it comes to testing paint colors, go Mighty. Scandi interior design originated in the Scandinavian countries many decades ago, but it has slowly built up momentum in other parts of the world, like here in North America. We did a video all about the design style itself, which you can check out if you missed it, but today is all about paint colors. I heard you folks, you wanted some colors, so that's what today's about. And I want to split this list up in half because to me, you can't really have Scandinavian colors without starting with some off-whites. So I have 4 of them that can be loosely defined in that category, which you can theoretically mix and match within your palette, or just stick to 1 or 2 to start as your base. The first one being the brightest white, the brightest Sherwin-Williams white paint color, which is called high reflective white. While not a necessity, some people will opt for the very brightest white paint color in a Scandi palette because it will naturally reflect the most amount of light possible. That's pretty much what makes a paint color feel lighter and brighter. And we can interpret this by looking at its light reflectance value on the Sherwin-Williams website. You simply search for it, in this case high reflective white, click on that details tab, and boom, there's the LRV, which is 93. That's an extremely high number. In fact, it's the highest I've come across in basically any paint color. This means that high reflective white is reflecting 93% of the light that hits it, which is pretty much as close to pure white as you're going to find. And if you know anything about Scandinavia, there are many months of the year where you're not getting a ton of natural light. So the light that you do have, whether it's coming from outside or being produced inside, you might want to amplify that as much as possible. And a mega bright white, like high reflective white, will do that for you. That being said, if you're a bit like me, maybe you don't need the brightest white possible. And maybe you're looking for something softer and warmer and cozy, kind of like my backdrop here. If you're one of those people, then the next color that I want to show you is Alabaster. Right away, we can tell that this color looks a little bit more of an off-white compared to that first one, and this is because it has a creamy tone present. That added color saturation inevitably lowers the LRV a bit, from 93 down to 82, which sounds like a big drop, but in practicality, the color still feels very light and welcoming. It's also just enough of a difference where your walls will allow pure white furniture and accessories to pop a bit off of those walls to create a little more visual texture through color contrast. On the other hand, with pure white walls, all those white things will just kind of seep into the walls. But to me, that's more suited for an art gallery rather than a home. Sorry, not sorry. Shots fired, okay? I don't like bright whites. I talk about Alabaster a lot, and I think it's a phenomenal interior paint color for many reasons, but it may deter some people that aren't crazy about that slight creamy yellow undertone that it has. So I wanted to give you a third white option that is more towards the light, warm gray side of things. Origami white comes in at a 76 LRV, and it feels a tad darker because of that amped up gray that's present. There still is some of that lingering warmth, but not necessarily in the form of beige, but more of a warm brown, which does suit Scandinavian inspired decor. Although you will have a lot more warmer leaning elements with Scandi, there's definitely room for some cool undertones as well, and Origami white has just a touch of it, which might help bridge the gap a little bit. Not quite as much as the fourth light color on this list, which is a lot cooler. It's called Crushed Ice. It just takes things a bit further into a gray direction, but what I like about it is it still feels kind of balanced and doesn't stand out too aggressively against any of the warmer whites that we've been talking about. It's a gray that isn't trying to compete with a color like Alabaster, even though they're fundamentally different. I don't know if this is a good way to describe different. They're just not fitting together, but they're still, in contact. I'm trying here. Crushed Ice has a 66 LRV, so it's still a light color, but it's starting to make its way towards mid-tone territory. So I wouldn't necessarily think of it as a first candidate main wall color for a Scandi design, but it's beautiful in small doses. Even medium doses for that matter, here and there. Let's finish off with the next 4 paint colors in this Scandi palette, which are going to be deemed as the colors that are not off-white. I think those first 4 that we talked about, they will encompass a majority of the color palette in some form or fashion, while these ones will definitely add some needed color in varying degrees of intensity. Starting with Oak Barrel, which is a brown tan color containing a bit of a red undertone to give it a slightly dusty feeling to it. This type of color is very common within Scandi design, as it can be represented with a bunch of the materials that are used, like wood and wicker, rope, and rattan. Not necessarily a color I would see reflected in paint as a paint color, but it's definitely something that really adds a lot to a Scandi color palette in one way or another. You may also see little pops of desaturated blue through some furniture or accessories in a color like Lakeside. This muted blue shade feels pretty tame for a blue, but it will stand out quite a bit next to the other colors we talked about, just because they're very, very different. I think there is room for a little bit of color here and there, but you don't necessarily want to pull too much focus with brighter, overly saturated blues. At least I don't. What a color like Lakeside accomplishes, though, is it just switches things up a little bit, so you're not completely enveloped in a sea of white, cream, and tan. After all, blue does have a soothing, therapeutic quality, which is something you might want to incorporate in your color palette. Another therapeutic color is green, and what better way to introduce it with something like Artichoke? This color doesn't look like guacamole, okay? It's just a deep, vegetative, fairly warm green that represents a dark accent color that also fits like a glove within the Scandi palette, especially when it's used through plants and greenery. That's something people forget about when you're putting a color palette together. You shouldn't just be focused on your wall color, your trim, even some of your accessories. You can incorporate some really beautiful deep greens from plant life, like succulents or a nice tall yucca cane plant, to instantly bring color and life to your space. Or you can forego the life part altogether and just get fake plants, so you can save yourself from the shame and sadness of having your plants die due to neglect or overwatering. Didn't even know that was a thing. Sometimes you can just put too much care into your plants. Am I right? Rest in peace, little cacti. The last color is probably my favorite, not because it's necessarily the most quintessential Scandi color out there, but it's one that really brings in some beautiful positivity, vibrance, and color to the palette. After all, a lot of these Scandinavian countries are a bit cooler temperature-wise, so why not bring the sun inside with a color like Sundance? I really love seeing a bit of yellow or orange to really inject some fun within a Scandi design, just a little bit. And Sundance is sort of a fusion of those two colors. It's definitely yellow at its core, but it just has enough of a red undertone to give it that orange touch, which helps soften the yellow's intensity just enough. But be mindful that if you use this color a lot in like a whole room, then I think your color palette will go from Scandi to postmodern, which is something completely different. But just the right amount of it can break up an otherwise monotonous design. And there's nothing wrong with monotonous either. Here are all the colors together. Let me know which one is your favorite down below. We have industrial design coming up soon, so get ready for that, my fellow paint people.